there. I've got a lesson for you today that's not all that long, but it does have a lot of stuff we can learn from it. So I'll get right into it. Now, with our last lesson, we were talking about the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry, and it's close to the end of his life, and he's trying to get a lot of things done and wrap things up um, before what happens to him happens to him. And he is there for the Passover celebration, which we find from John was something that he did all through his ministry. Passover being probably the most important, I'll take that out. I will say it's the most important observation in the Jewish calendar. And people would go to Jerusalem. They would have things like that's usually when they would pay their annual temple tax. So if you were a faithful Jewish person, you would contribute that amount, which I think was half a shekel, which was their money. And you would have certain sacrifices. And for those sacrifices, you had different materials that you would need depending on what sacrifice you were doing. But the primary sacrifice at this time tended to require um, unblemished animals, spotless animals. So Jesus is coming into the temple area and he sees something. Now, because people needed animals, and a lot of times they were traveling from other countries where the money was different, then when they got to Jerusalem, they would have to exchange the kind of money they use for the local money. So there were people there who would do that. And you have that now. If you go to other countries and you have dollars, then you can exchange the dollars for the kind of money that they use locally. And that makes sense. And with that, there's generally a little bit of a fee for the person who's doing that. Also, there were unblemished animals, and people who lived in the area of Judea and Galilee would take their own animals if they could, if they had them. Someone traveling a long way away might not be able to get an animal alive all the way to Jerusalem. And it was key that the animal had no defects. And one of that one of the possible defects was the animal being sick. Well, if you had to travel a long way, then the animal could become sick during that time. So there were people who would sell animals. They would sell other things that people would need for different sacrifices. Some were drink offerings, which were poured out. They would also need things like salt. So people were there to sell things and provide what the worshipers coming into the temple would need. So that was okay. Now, Jesus went in and he saw a problem with this, not from the activity that was going on, but where it was happening. Because you had people set up right there in part of the temple courts and selling things there. And he is furious about this because, and he quotes a scripture about this is supposed to be a place of prayer for all nations, but you've made it into a den of robbers. Well, there were two things that people were doing, and I'm talking about the merchants that they should not have been doing. And one of them, the primary one, is that they were not supposed to be conducting this kind of business in the temple area at all. The way the temple was set up, um, there were certain sections. Well, there was the outside the temple area, then there were certain sections in which people could come into, and it would get smaller and smaller based on the type of person. So, for instance, the people who were not Jewish believers but wanted to pray had an area they could go to. It was not as far up as the Jewish believers, and then the Jewish believers all of them could not go into an even smaller area where only the priests could go. And there was the tiniest area of all called the Holy of Holies, and the priests could not go into except for one of them one time per year. So there were rules about what could and could not happen in these areas. And the Gentiles, the people who were not Jewish, were having trouble finding a place where they could pray to God because there were people setting up tables and benches, and they had their cages with pigeons, not pigeons, doves, and they had cattle and sheep, all of these kind of animals that would be needed for certain sacrifices. And then you had people changing money. Well, this is where the second part of it seems to come into play, is that if somebody was coming in and they needed an animal for a sacrifice, didn't have one, well, they just might charge a little bit extra or a lot extra to the person. The same with the money changing. They might charge higher fees to change the money. And what's the person going to do? He wants to worship God. So you have the Gentiles who are trying to pray, but they're kind of pushed out of the one place where they can go. Then you have the Jewish people are wanting to get certain things for the sacrifices, are changing money, and then they're getting gouged, meaning a lot more money is taken away from them than should have been. And Jesus was enraged by this. So, you think about Jesus getting angry. Well, yes, he got angry. Now, the thing is that anger by itself is not a bad thing. We have to remember that there are times that God has been angry with the people because they aren't following him properly. Now, the important thing is what you do as well as why you're angry. Now, in the case of Jesus, it's because something that is dedicated to God the Father is being treated like it's nothing, like it's just anything else. And we have to remember things that are dedicated to God, we need to take seriously and be sure we act properly and take care of those things. Now, one of those things are his children, the people who follow him. So that comes back to us taking care of people who are following him. Now, should we take care of anyone who needs help? Yes, but especially so those who are following him. We should try to help them, and we know a lot of their needs, and we can do something about it. Now, what we find, all four Gospels mention a temple cleansing where Jesus goes through and he's driving people away who are trying to sell things or change money. He's turning over tables, and he was strong enough to do that. Coins are scattering everywhere. Um, in the book of John, which mentions him cleansing the temple, he gathers cords together, which are like rope, and uses it as a whip to drive out the cattle and the sheep that are there. He doesn't harm the doves, though. He is not there to harm the animals, but he does drive them out of the area. The cattle and sheep, the owners will be able to gather back the coins that are spilled. Uh, the owners will be able to gather those back up. But there is no doubt they have to get out of the temple area to do that. Now, there were a lot of people who provided these services and did so in the areas around Jerusalem, and they were okay. As far as we know, there was no problem with them, at least not this primary problem that Jesus was talking about. Now, in this, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all mention a cleansing of the temple. Uh, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it all is told right close to the triumphal entry. In fact, it's like the next day all of this happens. John, though, mentions this at the beginning of his gospel. And so people wonder, okay, is that the same one, or was there another time that Jesus did this? And from what I can tell looking at this, it seems to be more likely that it was an early temple cleansing where he did the same thing at the beginning of his ministry, and nothing had changed. And so that's an indictment. That's something bad about the um, priests, the leaders, because they allowed this to happen even after Jesus drove them out once. It was happening again when he went back. And a lot of those people who were in charge were corrupt, and they liked having all of this activity taking place. So you've got to start thinking at some point that maybe they were not following God like they should have. Certainly not the way many of the people were, and definitely not the way Jesus was following God. So, um, one note on this is that Luke has the shortest um, recollection amount of time that he talks about this, when usually Luke goes into great detail. And um, we don't know why. I just find that interesting. Um, Mark tells a good bit about it, because people come to him and say, by what authority are you doing this? And Jesus, kind of looks at them and they say, show us a sign, meaning show us a miracle that you have the authority. And he said, all right, destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. Well, they're thinking he's talking about the actual building of the temple. And they're saying, oh, it's taken 46 years to get it to this point. And you'd say you can do it in 3 days? What are you talking about? Well, he wasn't talking about that. He was talking about his own body, that destroy his body and it can be rebuilt. In fact, Jesus can rebuild it in 3 days. And the disciples later on figure this out and go, oh, that's what he was talking about. Now, after this happens, we know that there were problems with this later, because Jesus was not the only person who came along and tried to drive out the people who were trying to use God to make money. And if you wonder about the problem with this, you go, okay, I can see him doing this, but why was it a big deal? And all. And you think of it this way. Let's say you go to church and you're sitting down and you're listening to the preacher talking, and then someone comes in there and starts selling popcorn and snacks and drinks on the aisle, and they're changing money back and forth while the preacher's trying to talk. And it's very distracting to the people. And some people, okay, they're going to hear the crunching of the popcorn, or people might spill the drink, and just creates all kind of distraction. That's the way to think about this. And I'll leave you with this last bit before I go, is that anger can be a dangerous thing. But if you use it correctly, if you use it properly in the way it's supposed to be done, you can accomplish great things that otherwise might not be done. You just have to be very careful how you use it. Okay, with that, I will let you go, and I hope to see you again next time.